with that, I can get started with kind of overview of housekeeping stuff. I will pin myself for now. So my name is Thea. I'm one of the representatives from Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. So for housekeeping stuff, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll take them, or you can direct message Beatrice, who will come up as B, and she'll put them in the questions, and Meenakshi will choose which questions to give to the speakers. We do have a list of questions we're going to start with so that we have kind of a good basis of the topic, and then we will get to people's questions after that. Besides that, if anyone is having any technical issues, you can contact the CSSDP email, which I'm going to put in the chat, or direct message via BEA. So the first thing that I want to do is acknowledge the territory we're on and kind of the intersections that ongoing colonization has with this work and with criminalization and the harmful effects that it has had. For me, I am in Vancouver, and most of our speakers and most of the people who are registered are in the Vancouver area. So I'm going to acknowledge that I am on unceded and stolen Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territory. And I encourage everyone to kind of take note of what land they are on if you are in the Lower Mainland, or if you are beyond that. And then Megan, do you want to introduce you guys, and then I can introduce CSSDP?
Sure. So my name is Megan, and I'm the coordinator of UBC Law Students for Decrim and Harm Reduction. We are an organization of law students seeking to promote the rights and well-being of people who use drugs or do sex work, using both legal and policy approaches. And we're also interested in public education initiatives regarding drug use, sex work, harm reduction, and related issues.
Okay. And then CSSDP, Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy. We are a national organization, but the Vancouver chapter has been planning this panel, and our focus is on drug policy and how that affects people from a student lens. So that is who we are, but I want to turn it over to Meenakshi to introduce the speakers.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Thea and Megan, and for all the folks with Canadian Students for Sensible Drug Policy and law students for Decrim. Really appreciate all the work that you've done into and bringing this panel back. We're a month into de facto Decrim in BC. People are still rotting in prisons and jails, so I'm excited to hear what people's reflections are. Did the sky fall on January 31st? So my name is Meenakshi. I work at Pivot as a criminalization and policing campaigner, and tonight I'm just going to be moderating this conversation and helping to move it along. I know some folks are already in the chat. If you want to share where you're joining from, that's really awesome to learn about. As mentioned, I think most of us are on Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh homelands tonight. And I'm now just going to introduce the 5 panelists who will be speaking. And it's going to be a really great conversation. So I'm going to start with who's showing up on my screen. So first we have Caitlin Shane. Caitlin is a staff lawyer at Pivot and a colleague of mine. As the drug policy lawyer, she takes direction from drug user-led movements. And through this direction, she's appeared at the Supreme Court of Canada, the Federal Court of Canada, the BC Supreme Court, and various committees of both the House and Commons and the Senate. So she's read a lot of legal fiction. Next, we have Delilah Gregg, who is originally from Fort St. James, Carrier Nation. Delilah's been a leader at the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, VANDU, for 8 years, and she's currently the president, Madame President to you, of the Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society. Delilah is also a core member of Our Homes Can't Wait Coalition and Defund 604 Network. Seated with Delilah is Vince Powell, community organizer at VANDU. And prior to working at VANDU, Vince was a labor organizer with the Teaching Support Staff Union, TSSU, at SFU, and also worked as a librarian in Vancouver's Chinatown. You guys have been moving around on my screen, so next,
just sitting here.
you two are the only ones not moving. Next, we've got Jeremy Kalicum. So for many years, Jeremy's been watching the crisis of drug toxicity tear apart communities and take the lives of our friends and families. He's been driven to act and make real changes, including through direct action on the overdose crisis. Jeremy has worked with prominent drug user-led organizations. He's a co-founder of the Drug User Liberation Front, DULF, and he's pushing for evidence-informed and public health-based policy. And our final panelist this evening is Garth Mullins. Garth is an old school dope fiend, drug user activist, and award-winning radio documentarian. He's the host and executive producer of the Crackdown podcast, where drug users cover the drug war as war correspondents. And he's also an organizer with VANDU, a trade union activist, and a musician in the local band Blow Dead Space. Thank you folks all so much for joining, for sharing expertise tonight. And the way this is going to work is we've got some questions that folks sent in advance, and then people who are here tonight are welcome to share their question in the chat, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. I want to start with the folks who are working on the front line in the so-called downtown east side at VANDU, a heavily targeted, criminalized drug user-led space. And Vince and Delilah, I'm wondering if you could start things off tonight and telling us what have you seen change since the exemption was implemented? We can start with that, and then I've got a couple more follow-up questions. So what have you seen change over the last month?
I've not really seen any change yet because it just basically started, right? And yeah, I think maybe the only way I'll see the change is if I'm standing there when the cops are arresting somebody and trying to weigh out their dope or eyeball their dope or whatever they're going to do, right? So for me, that's yeah, but I mean, I think people might be a little bit more careful nowadays, you know, with the cops all rolling around, so many of them lately, it seems like. So that might be a couple of things there, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with Del. There hasn't been, we've been talking about decriminalization, and every Tuesday we hold our weekly Tuesday education action group, and we've been asking the question: has anyone been stopped? Have they had their drugs or money taken from them? We haven't really heard much. It's only been a month, right? And as we know, like, when policy is decided, it needs to kind of trickle down to actual police behavior, right? But we do know that the training, unit for the average constable is an optional 45-minute video. I think some people on the panel may have seen it, but from what I've seen, yeah, they, as Del was saying, eyeballing the dope, they, like, one of the slides is literally an image of like what could be 2.5 grams in a baggie, and just examples of like, this might be 2.5 grams, this might be more, this might not be. So I'm not too sure about the rest of the content of this training unit, but again, like we really haven't seen changes on the ground, substantial ones at least.
Thanks for that, Vince. And I think what you two highlight is this really important piece that de facto decrim also assumes that police behavior can change based on policy directives from the provincial government in this case, which, you know, totally runs counter to common sense and the lived experience of anyone who's ever interacted with a cop. They certainly don't pull out a book and make sure that your rights aren't being violated as they beat you up or rob you. So I want to move kind of now into the next piece, which is a question for Garth around the implementation. So Garth, I know that you've been commenting a lot online about the decrim and, you know, if cops are still involved, it's not decrim. Would you be down to tell us a little bit more about how you think the exemption should have been implemented or could have been implemented? But you are muted. That's right, folks.
People have
Podcast.
been probably hoping for that mute button to affect me for a long time. So the reason I was involved in this whole recent round of the provincial government's change in policy is because the VANDU board, you know, which is elected by the membership of VANDU, sort of directs a lot of what we do. And myself and Caitlin and Brittany Graham were sort of asked to go to these meetings with the province. And they started to occur because we had been in the streets demanding the police off our backs since the 90s, since the last overdose crisis. And so, like, the extent of the fact that anything happened at all is because of pressure and organization and us being in the streets, right? Like the government didn't decide to make any changes out of its own kindness or good heart. And although the changes are rather limited, the fact of them at all sort of demonstrates a little bit of community power. I think it's important that we don't lose track of that in all of the very proper critiques that we make of this model of decriminalization. We were looking for a threshold that would decriminalize all of us, you know, so we were never consulted on. We never had an opportunity to really opine on what the thresholds are. So this 2.5 cumulative for opioids, coke, meth, and MDMA, that came right out of some policy wonk somewhere and some politicians and ministers. We had no hand in that, and we objected right from the beginning. We said it's not the right substances. First of all, it's funny to see MDMA there. Not that I'm against decriminalization of MDMA, but we're not seeing huge waves of criminalization around MDMA, but we are around benzodiazepines. So they aren't listed. And we saw a lot of effort to direct this policy at our behavior. And the demand from VANDU has been forever is get the police out of our lives, right? It's not, that's the true measure of whether this is good or not, is the extent to which there's less arrests, there's less jail time, there's less charges, there's less people with charges getting fired, evicted, or having their kids taken, or any of that stuff, right? That's how you measure whether it's decrim or not. But what the province and the feds are setting up is this: how many of us are getting sort of nudged into treatment? How many of us are getting healthy and quitting drugs and stuff? And that may be all nice, and there's treatment discussions to be had, but it's not really to do with decriminalization. So my worry is that this has strayed so far from VANDU's vision, the original vision that we've had for 25 years of what decriminalization should look like, that when people go to measure it, you know, in 2 years when Pierre Poilievre is prime minister, and they're measuring it on the basis of, oh, how many people went and got help or went and got straight, got clean and sober, they're not going to see numbers that reflect that, because that's a different discussion. That's not to do with policing. The other thing it's not going to change is the number of dead, which is why we also fight for safe supply. So if it's measured against those sort of squishy presumed government metrics, it'll be easy to write it off as a failure. Having low thresholds will make it easy to write off as a failure, because lots of people in VANDU are still criminalized. Like our president says, Kevin Yake, right? He says 2.5 grams, that's like breakfast for me, man. So yeah, that was our original vision, was something that would be more inclusive and would back the cops right off us, not have the cops sitting in the front seat of what it looks like.
Thanks, Garth. I mean, what you really highlighted is how absolutely not intersectional. This approach to decrim is. And as we all know, criminalization is not just a cop eyeballing the dope on you to see if it looks like 2.5 grams. It is oftentimes a lot more subtle. It's nudging you towards MCFD involvement. It's forcing pregnant and parenting folks to go into treatment in order to retain custody of their kids. It's forcing people to interact with things like drug courts so that they don't have to like go to like a correctional center. None of which has been addressed in de facto decrim, right? And I think it is really important to acknowledge that de facto decrim doesn't exist for incarcerated folks in DC. It doesn't exist for people who are on remand, who are in provincial or federal jails or immigration detention centers. It really is so emblematic of co-optation, right? I think that's what you kind of laid out, Garth. That for 25 years, VANDU's been crystal fucking clear about what decrim would mean. And it wasn't two cops deciding threshold amounts.
And I mean, we're sure used to this, right? Like we fight for a lot of campaigns. We're the people who fought for the safe injection sites, and that very highly clinical, highly institutional model in one place where you have to line up. That was never our vision of it, right? So I think everybody in social justice movements gets used to being an organizer and sort of demanding something that might fix things. And then the government, when they're pressured, when their arms twisted, they give these half measure. And it doesn't mean that you stop and celebrate the half measure. It means you just keep fucking fighting, you know?
Mm-hmm. But there is, you know, an important moment to acknowledge that because people fought for decades and in the face of so much loss, we did see, you know, government have to respond even through a co-opted half measure. They still had to fucking respond. Jeremy, I'm wondering if you can pick up this piece around safe supply. So the rhetoric that we're hearing, especially from government, from Pierre Poilievre, but you know, even the NDP is so muddled. Can you tell us a little bit about how decrim relates to safe supply, but also how it doesn't?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. And I just kind of want to acknowledge the perspective that I'm bringing from a place of extreme privilege, and as a person who hasn't been criminalized for substance use or any of my personal substance use, but I do bring a perspective of a person who distributes drugs and is heavily involved in safe supply. That being said, the Drug User Liberation Front has been distributing, you know, what we call community regulated supply of drugs, which many would interpret to be safe supply. And the way that decriminalization has intersected with that is close to none. And you know, I think it was touched well on with the comments of Meenakshi and Garth, in that, you know, this decriminalization response was really, you know, a result from the political pressure that was put on, and not an actual genuine attempt to stop overdose. So I think when you look at a lot of measures that would actually impact the overdose death that we're seeing, or help create a more equitable society that we live in, it's not going to impact that. So I think it's important to take that kind of critical lens onto that. So has it affected safe supply in any way? The answer is no, and it likely will not.
Thanks for that, Jeremy. And like, before we do move on, we've got a lot more questions. I do want to applaud each of you because I know you have been at the forefront of this, and you know, we all are organizers in different ways. It's easy to like be super critical, but I think, you know, there's over 60 people here listening in who I think are also really moved by the work that you've each been behind, and a lot more will watch the recording. Caitlin, I'm gonna kick it to you, and I'm wondering, like, we've heard from Delilah and Vince about how there hasn't really been a lot of change for folks on the ground. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about what you've seen in terms of local government response, because I know you've seen a lot in month one.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll just preface it by saying that throughout our participation on the core planning table, Pivot and VANDU routinely, and I mean routinely, every meeting brought up that the province really needs to keep an eye on local governments following the implementation of decriminalization, because the pattern that we've seen internationally is that criminal sanctions may well be removed, but they can immediately be replaced with administrative sanctions. And of course, that is not a part of our vision of decriminalization. We all know that administrative sanctions are just excuses to continue punishing, penalizing, incarcerating, taking kids away from the same people that were captured under criminalization. So we were really clear that we expected the province to take an active role in monitoring what was happening on the ground with local governments passing bylaws that relate to public drug consumption. And of course, municipalities, because they don't have jurisdiction over public health, must get all public health bylaws approved by the province. So there's actually like this legal piece that exists there for the province to use to their advantage to say, hey, you actually can't pass bylaws like that without our approval and our consultation. We never really got much of a response from the province or the ministry when we kept raising this. And then sure enough, about 2 days before Decrim came into effect, we saw the city of Campbell River pass a bylaw that prohibited all public drug consumption. So right off the bat, you see this very clear undermining of the provincial decrim policy. We at Pivot actually challenged these bylaws at the BC Supreme Court, and they have since rescinded the bylaws, which is great, but we know that Campbell River is just one of many communities that's contemplating bylaws like this. I read today that Sicamous is considering almost an identical bylaw to Campbell River. I've heard that Merritt is considering a bylaw, Nelson. So, the way that this province has handled drug policy has consistently been to offload its responsibilities onto people who use drugs and their allies. That is the name of the game historically, currently. It's like, and it's just entirely inappropriate that the onus has fallen to communities to play this game of whack-a-mole, fighting local government bylaws. That is the jurisdiction, the authority, and the responsibility of the province, and yet they continue to pass the buck to people who use drugs. It's just par for the course. So I don't know what will be to come. I am hoping that the province will see that, community after community after community is passing bylaws like this, and that they should actually take an active stance, but I don't have any faith that that will happen. So that's the local government picture at the moment. It's bleak.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, Garth also started talking about this earlier, where it's hard not to see a model like it's been designed to fail from the outset. And when you see the province effectively failing to use the powers available to it, it's just another reminder of how little investment they have in, public health emergency that's approaching a decade at this point. We talked a little bit about local government, and I'm wondering if anyone would be into talking a bit about what they're seeing on the public health side. So that could mean anything from overdose prevention site responses to this specter that's haunting us, right? Treatment, which is not inherently a bad thing whatsoever. But when it's, a different form of caging, it certainly raises a concern. So I'm wondering if anyone wants to talk about the ways they've seen public health really co-opted through this de facto decrim process.
I don't know whether it's via this process, but running parallel to it has been this conversation that's been going on inside the NDP government here in BC for, since 2020 anyway, about mandatory treatment. That is like the terms under which the government could lock people up under the Mental Health Act or under some other mechanism for being a drug user, being a young drug user, for overdosing. The sorts of criteria change, and they're never really transparent. But the government has taken 2 runs at this bill. And then when Premier Eby was taking over from Horrigan, he did sort of a tour of British Columbia where he talked about the importance of this, really hit it hard, and said, we got to reopen Riverview, which is the old mental health hospital in Coquitlam. And, he then sort of slightly walked it back. But then when Brittany Graham and I met with the new Minister of Addictions and Mental Health, we said, look, will you just put this rumor to rest? Will you just say mandatory treatment is off the table? And she said, oh, no, we're going to continue it. And then in the first week of the legislature, David Eby said, oh, yes, we're reviewing this. So it's very weird. They're just not, they're not coming out with it. And then this week, nurse practitioners were given the authority to give people a psych hold, whereas usually it took doctors. And interestingly, Eby was quoted as saying, this will help emergency wait times. So you see, we're being sort of weaponized against people who are concerned about waiting at hospitals for treatment. Like, oh, it's those drug users or whatever who are getting in the way. So it's this very nebulous policy, but it's also very scary too. BC already uses the Mental Health Act to abrogate the human rights of people, something like 28,000 times in the last year I can remember the statistics for, which is to just seize them and hold them against their will, in a locked ward or something like that. So this is like the kind of criminalization in parallel to decriminalization. And I think we have to watch that and fight that. But they don't come out with it direct, because the very first time they did, they introduced a bill and we all got together, a big coalition of us, and squashed that shit right away. So they're getting a little more slippery about it.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know Pivot's got a forthcoming position paper on involuntary treatment, because involuntary treatment, no matter who it's applied to, is wrong, whether it's folks who are disabled or otherwise institutionalized, whether it's applied to people who use drugs. It is a very, very horrifying regime that's happening in locked wards, in forensic jails and forensic psych centers. And as someone is saying, it's also ineffective. Yes, it's like violating people's human rights. I mean, it's what Angela Davis always talks about, right? Prisons don't get rid of social problems, but they do disappear them. And involuntary treatment is such a powerful example of that. And, it's bad when you see the folks who are advocating for it, whether it's the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, the Victoria Police Chief, who was quoted in the BC government's press release on nurse practitioners being allowed to certify. I don't know what Del Manic has to say about that. Yeah, it's a very horrifying regime. I think, like, I know you did an episode of Crackdown where you went to Riverview, talked about your own family's experience with institutionalization. And yeah, the timing's just so obvious, right? The BC, it's like paltry, minuscule form of decrim, and then there's such an intense national campaign of coordinated backlash to drug users' rights and existence. I'm going to go back to folks who are doing direct action in a very specific way, because everyone here is doing direct action. But at VANDU, I'm wondering if Vince or Delilah can talk a little bit about like impact on your day-to-day operations, like sitting at all these government tables that go nowhere is a fucking time suck. But how else have you seen crim planning impact your day-to-day operations?
Pastel?
I totally didn't get that. I mean, I heard, but I just like, what? Um, maybe you can, I just.
Yeah, I can start.
Yeah.
Well, I think that, you know, when Decrim was first put on the table by ex-mayor Kennedy Stewart, you know, we launched into a campaign because we knew immediately that he broke his first promise, which was that drug users would be, you know, talked to and consulting on Decrim all the way. I think, yeah, Garth has a recording of that actually. He had one round table with the mayor, I think in December 2020, and he didn't contact VANDU or talk to any drug user groups until, let's say, April the next year. And by that time, they had already submitted the first component of, you know, their package to Health Canada with the thresholds already recommended. The ones, and these aren't even the last thresholds, but they were already too low. And you know, it was obvious that we needed to fight back, right? That one, it was a slap in the face to all drug users and to those who have passed to, you know, lie about consulting drug users. But the way in which it was planned out and already submitted to Health Canada was clearly going down a bad path. And so we launched into action, and so we immediately started to, you know, agitate, talk to media. We ended up doing a demonstration. Nonetheless, you know, they still submitted their final package, and it's been chewed over at the provincial level, so on and so forth. But I think that, you know, part of the issue was that once it was brought to the province, again, it was, even though we had Britt and we had Garth there representing VANDU, they had learned that they don't want this to be a public mess. So they had all these conversations and consultations behind closed doors over Zoom, right? And it kind of demobilized, you know, folks on the ground who were concerned about how Decrim would play out. And so I think that, you know, as we, you know, once that's a lesson there, right? As Meenakshi brought up, there's a bunch of Zoom calls with a bunch of people that don't give a shit. And that we must, you know, take the politics back into the streets, right? And bring it back into the communities that will affect most, i.e. Vancouver's downtown east side, for instance, but all across BC, as Caitlin and Meenakshi have brought up, that this is, yeah, it's kind of been like a kind of Pandora's box, right? And it was because, you know, Kennedy Stewart, he's trying to make a buck off this fucking book that he's publishing this month, I think. You know, again, like applauding himself. And it was a kind of political move, but one that backfired immensely. And one has to think, as Meenakshi said, was this set up to fail, right? Because yeah, the kind of political backlash comes from a lack of public education around Decrim, right? That, you know, the government should be actually, you know, it's quite a complicated and complex issue. Again, they just rolled it out, and it was a present to, you know, the Canadian far right to be like, oh, they're decriminalizing drugs, and Pierre Poilievre and all his thugs, you know, can roll in on a like badly botched public policy rollout that again has not really affected people on the streets that much. Right. And in fact, it has had actually adverse results in these new bylaws, like, you know, spouting up all across BC. So I don't know if, yeah, I don't want to sound too pessimistic, but it's not looking good. But like VANDU, we are, you know, planning on working with some partners, you know, some academic partners to start monitoring this, right? Because we know that, you know, this ultimately there needs to be eyeballs on the ground to actually see if police behavior has changed. Are they still taking people's drugs? Are they still, you know, charging people? These are all questions that, you know, it's up to us as a community to actually, you know, pay attention to, record, because again, there's been what was it, like Health Canada also is not allowing local researchers from BC to actually monitor the policy rollout, right? And that's like, that should be a big red flag. Like, why are they not letting local researchers who know the community, know the issues, actually watch how this policy is being made and deployed? It stinks. There's something very fishy about it.
Yeah, I mean, what just Vince was saying about not letting the researchers do things because they know we're going to tell the truth while they're just sending out bullshit, pretty much, right? And they don't know any better. You know, there's something. Oh my God, it just left my brain. Okay. Yeah. You know, in regards to like this 2.5 grams, I mean, so many people down here or anywhere do that much for breakfast. Right. And also 2.5 grams of something that changes your thinking and all that. How about alcohol? How about pills? Can people get charged with only 2.5 pills? You know what I mean? Or something like, it's like, why is it only these illicit drugs, you know? And it's ridiculous. I mean, you know, at one time alcohol was, you know, not allowed. It was prohibition, right? So it's like, what the hell? I mean, it changes the states of people's minds. Pills does the same thing, right? It's, yeah, I was talking to Vincent, I'm like, I just don't get it. Like, why is it? I mean, I understand it's killing people, but come on now, right? I mean, it's when they're really, I think, to my understanding, it's like when the government puts out like the fentanyl, they're the ones that are trying to kill the people off, it seems like to me, right? And it's really frustrating because I've lost so many people, and I'm just so tired of people dying. And my vice president, Lorna Bird, she has a list of people, and there are 263 at least of people that she's known. And I don't know how long now of people that have died from overdose. And I really hope we don't have to add any more names to that, because it's ridiculous, right? You know, and it just, I don't know, it seems like within the last 6 years, well, since the pandemic, that this has really gone downhill. Before, you know, I just, you know, I don't get it, right? And, you know, and to kudos to everybody who's trying their best to keep people alive or trying to make change for the little people, right? You know, government needs to take a look of the art of war, and, you know, you take care of your people, your kingdom will build and it won't crumble, and just stuff like that, right? So, yeah.
Thanks, Delilah. I've got a couple of questions from the chat. I'm going to combine one because I think there's two that are really centered on colonialism. So what do folks, like, and anyone can approach this, but like, what do folks think of, like, in terms of anti-racism, anti-white supremacy, anti-settler colonialism? Does this regime of de facto decrim even get close to approaching that? Like, are Black, Indigenous, and otherwise racialized drug users meaningfully protected? Yeah, obviously not, right?
Obviously
Yeah.
not. Yeah, obviously
No.
not. I mean, I think one way to look at it is that, you know, decrim should be, to the word, you decriminalize, this should be quite simple.
Yeah.
But yet the way it's played out, the power is still in the cops' hands, right? Now they have to do this little new dance if they choose to do so, if they find you with drugs. But in the end, it's, you know, the choice of whether you are charged or whether they take away your shit or whether they beat you up, that still remains intact, right? And so this is a win that's not really a win because it has not changed that balance of forces, right? And we know that, yeah, Black, Indigenous, unhoused people, disabled people, the entirety of the downtown east side is hyper-criminalized. As Meenakshi said, like, you know, one policy change will not change the behavior of police that have been trained for decades to consider every single person in the downtown east side as an enemy to be contained. And so, I'm sorry, it hasn't done any of those things, I don't think.
And I mean, in regards to, in regards to like mandatory treatment, the only way treatment I find really works is if you're willing to do it. You don't be forced by the judge making you do it or getting your kids back or your work, right? You'll always, you're just setting yourself up to fail. That's something I do know. So in order to get treatment, you have to be willing to do it or it's going to fail, right? Or people are going to end up dying, which is what will most likely happen. I just want to throw that in there.
I mean, it's such an incomplete answer, you know, but the regime we have here is 2.5 grams, not 1. The cops wanted it 1. We wanted it like 18 or whatever, right? Was our original, something like that. But the fact that it's not 1, that it's 2.5, that's down to us. The fact that encoded in this section 56 exemption is not like, if you're caught with drugs, you must. It doesn't say that anywhere. There's no you must, like you must get points against your driver's license. You must pay a fine. You must call a line to see about treatment. You must go to a meeting. There is nothing like that because of us, right? So like, as we shit on this, and there is lots of shitting on it to do, we got to remember that we're an agent in all of this. We're part of this fucking equation. We weren't spectators on this policy. The first meeting I went to about this shit was in 1998.
Wow.
The first time I was arrested for drugs was when I was 19 in 1990. It scared the fucking shit out of me. It was a tiny amount. I got charged under California's methamphetamine and other substances. Right. And so the fact that we win a fucking inch when we still have to go a mile doesn't negate our power, our community power. Vince is right. We got to put ourselves in the street more. If we had put ourselves in the street more, maybe we would have said 3.5. We would have seen an 8 ball or 4.5 or 10 or something like that. Right. But it's fucking hard to do that because as a movement, we're fractured because we all got benzo dope, which makes meetings more difficult to organize because we're all fucking dying. We're all fucking going down to Glenhaven Funeral Home every other fucking week to say goodbye to our comrades. We're all holding, instead of holding meetings, we're holding memorials. You know, so it's really hard to fucking organize under those circumstances. But I don't want to erase, even though it's flawed and fucked and insufficient. But these are the trophies of our incomplete victory that we plant on the land of our enemies. And that's what this one is, right? So we got to look at that shiny trophy and realize those words incomplete and enemy and all that and keep fighting. But we got to measure our own power. And those moments where we're in the room with government, the thing you get to do is you get to measure your own power and their own power. And the fact that Caitlin and me and Britt and Ellie, we organized a super majority of that fucking Zoom. We didn't just sit there as passive fucking observers to a government shenanigans. We organized that Zoom call so that there was a massive majority. There was everybody, all the civil society groups, all the First Nation groups, all the health groups, all the groups that were on that call and us and all the other drug user groups. And then on the other side, there's cops and government officials. And the massive majority that was us says, set the limit, set the threshold, if there has to be one, as high as the drug users need. And they fucking lost. The cops and the government lost, but they had to concede a little bit. And so I always look for, in every moment, everything I do is like, what increases our community power? What's evidence of our community power? Where do we have some? Where do we have none? Where do we need more? And so for me, this struggle isn't over yet. It's just begun. And we need to be in the street more because fucking A, Meenakshi's right. This doesn't do shit all to dismantle white supremacy, right? But like, we also aren't naive about what governments do and how they work. Governments never give you something just because they're nice and it's in their heart. You got to twist their fucking arm every time to get them to do it. And that's the job. That's what we signed up for. That's why we've been at it for 25 years.
Wow.
Sorry, Del.
No, that's like, wow, that's cool. You're awesome. Mr. G, you're awesome.
And you, girl.
Hey, good night.
I know Jeremy and Caitlin also wanted to chime in on this around, I'm not sure if you folks specifically want to speak to whether or not de facto decrim in BC dismantles white supremacy, which is a laughable statement, but
Yeah.
and MHA is patting themselves on the back or something else. So Jeremy, and then I'll pass it to Caitlin.
Yeah, I was just going to ask permission to speak to the question more broadly.
Permission granted, young man.
So yeah, I would just basically say, you know, all the problems that we've had before Decrim are problems that we're still going to have. In that, you know, just like we talked about earlier, that, you know, Decrim was a response to political pressure to act like they were doing something. So, you know, white supremacy, racism, all the things that we've experienced before, we're going to continue to experience. And Decrim comes with pros, like we were talking about, and it comes with cons. So some of the pros, you know, people in rural regions, you know, say they were getting, you know, jacked up, and that, you know, ideally, if we were going to realize the potential of Decrim, people wouldn't be getting, you know, jacked up and their drugs taken anymore. Will those pros be realized? That's I think what Garth was getting at, in that it's gonna be a result of continued pressure and organizing. And, you know, and the cons like that were previously mentioned is it's also signal to the, you know, what would accurately be described as the opposition to mobilize as well. So we have some things in our corner, in that, you know, we already have organizations and organizing, and we have evidence on our side, and we really need to push for accurate and comprehensive evidence to be taken to really see, you know, what's happening with Decrim, and if it's being done right, The only thing we don't have is money. I mean, as well as a lot of other things, but one of the things is money. But you know, a lot of us are working for free or for pittance, despite what the city of Vancouver may say. You know, so that's my 2 cents on it.
Thank you, Jeremy. Caitlin, over to you.
Yeah, I was just going to add something to what Garth was saying, which I think is important for us not to lose sight of, which is kind of like, you know, as much as we did not get the policy that we wanted, as much as we, whatever, the process of being a part of developing this policy has led to major connections and comradeship with other drug user-led groups around the province. So one thing that was really cool to watch while sitting on this court planning table was other burgeoning drug user-led groups kind of like looking to VANDU for advice on how to proceed and how to be on these tables and how to talk to these politicians. And as a result, we ended up with like incredible comrades, redone Rural Empowered Drug User Network, who's doing amazing work with drug users up north and who we consult with regularly now as a result of being on this table. I think that power can't be underestimated. And like we now have this informal network where we are constantly in dialogue with one another around the province about how police are not following through with the mandate of Decrim, or what local governments are doing when they're passing bylaws, or what we're seeing at the ground level. And that like that dialogue that has emerged more strongly, I think is really amazing, and a testament to like a policy that applies around the province, is that you get people who are affected around the province kind of banding together, which is cool. The other thing I was just going to say was that I think Vince touched on a really important point about kind of like decriminalization is really simple. It does not have to be this hyper variable policy with all of these different factors of threshold quantities and age demographics and location and all of this stuff. Like it's very simple. Either the federal government repeals the provision that prohibits drug possession, or the health minister grants an exemption to everyone in Canada rather than everyone in BC. And you don't make it contingent on age or amount or substance or location. Like just fucking stop criminalizing people for possessing drugs. That's all there is to it. This is what happens when bureaucrats start putting their hands all over the ideas of people who use drugs. You get this weird, watered down, compromised, hyper technical policy that no one knows what the fuck is going on, right? Like that's what happens when we were really clear about what we wanted in the first place. Yeah, that's my 2 cents.
I mean, I would offer that it's because this model of like haphazard decrim stands to benefit a lot of people in very material ways.
100%. It was never about decriminalizing people. It's never been about that. Each of these conditions is a tool for them to continue to criminalize who they want to criminalize.
And like, I really appreciate what you've said about the connections that were made. I feel like granddaddy Garth Mullins right now, because I think that is the importance of organizing, right? When, you know, hearing from Garth, who's, you know, talking about nearly, well, 3 decades, right, of organization and the drug war. And every time folks come up against like a new fight, they also meet new comrades, they get a deeper analysis. I think it's important to acknowledge that like tonight's panel is also very like Metro Vancouver and downtown East Side informed, and that's not necessarily the experience of every drug user across BC or Canada. And there's shortcomings around the de facto decrim that really, really fail urban or remote, rural drug users and folks who live on reserves, where they may also face additional criminalization.
more ways than one.
Yeah. So again, like there's a, yeah, I think that's another kind of deliberate shortcoming of this model, right? Is to create such focus on a heavily stigmatized neighborhood like the downtown east side, where police are always going to have a big part of the pie, but also not talking about the realities for folks who do possess significant quantities of drugs because they're traveling for hours to get to a dealer, because they're buying in bulk for people in their community, and they're doing like community-based safe supply in light of prohibition. I'm seeing a couple of other questions here, and Jeremy, I'm wondering if you could speak to this one that's about activist programs that team up with researchers to generate and analyze data. I know that VANDU and DULF are trying to evaluate their community source safe supply program. Can you share more about what that evaluation looks like and how you've tried to build it ethically?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. I prepared responses to most of the questions, so I'm kind of going off the cuff here. But yeah, what we've tried to do is make sure that the stuff that we're doing and the activism that we're creating is being ethically and accurately analyzed and collected. So what we've done is we've worked hand in hand with the Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users and the Western Aboriginal Harm Reduction Society, as well as other representatives from the community, including an Indigenous Advisory Committee to DULF, to create an evaluation framework that measures how what we're calling community regulated supply is impacting people, and making sure that data is going to be used to the benefit of the community, and not to make someone's career, or to get research funding, or kind of perpetuate this kind of academic shit. So that's kind of what we've been trying to do, and whether it's, I think it's really hard to collect this data in a way that isn't going to be refuted right off the bat, by the off. Like, you need to make really strong research methods that are both community based and impartial, and that's really hard to do. But I think we're doing it okay, but remains to be seen. So yeah, that's it, I think.
Yeah, like, has anyone here gotten a book deal out of the last 2 years?
A what?
A book deal.
Not yet.
I mean, a lot of folks have gotten tenure and promotions and book deals for saving the drug users of the downtown east side. I mean, I can't think of a non-white person, but like, you got your Benjamin Perrins, your Kennedy Stewarts, your Travis Lupics, like all these folks who have really profited off of the backs of collective struggle, right?
VANDU is writing a book right now. It's going to be cool.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Let's hear a little bit about this book.
No, I'm just kidding.
It's a secret. No, it's just our 25-year anniversary.
Yeah,
That's
I'm on a 25-year committee. We're amazed by the pictures I'm seeing, and like, wow, and the history behind it all, and just trying to put a timeline into a book. And it's funny because myself and where I used to work with my supervisor, we talked about, well, VANDU should put together a book for the tabletop, so and then all of a sudden out I'm like, whoa, man, this was planned. But that's our book deal, kind of. And you're all going to be in it, I'm pretty sure.
I mean, we've talked a lot about VANDU's long history, and I think we are at an important moment around the fight for decriminalization, like not this bullshit patched together job, but like the real decriminalization of drug users. I'm gonna put this one to you first, Garth. Like, how do you feel about the current momentum behind Decrim? I know it's been like an exhausting year so far, but yeah.
I mean, like processes like the government's running right now have this effect of draining a lot of energy away from activism, so like I feel like, we decide collectively how to approach the government, right? We decide collectively if we're going to go to the meetings and under what circumstances we all walk out the door together, and we have done that. And I think we have to be careful because these meetings can be like a vampire and just suck your blood. So I think the momentum is like a little drained right now, but there's also like let's wait and see what happens. I think we're kind of waiting to respond. But also what I feel is like over the last year, a huge backlash is gaining speed. And a lot of people who have been harm reduction activists and stuff over the last 10 years, it might not be familiar. You might have to go back further into the real nasty old days of backlash to be familiar with what's coming, because we're seeing, government elected in the city of Vancouver solely on the promise to crack down on people with 100 more cops. You're seeing like an incredibly popular guy leading the Conservative Party who's probably going to be the next prime minister of the country based on his like chummying up with the convoy movement, which is a far right white supremacist fucking cosplay basically. And you're seeing the same thing at the provincial level, like a right-wing opposition, and now even the BCNDP talking way more about public safety, and they don't mean us, our public, then they talk about harm reduction or anything like that. So there is a turn coming. There is a backlash against the rather sort of anemic, small, half-measure policies that came to represent harm reduction over the last 10 or 15 years. And that's not just in Canada. It's not just in BC. It's across Canada. It's in Ottawa. It's definitely in Alberta. And it's in the US too, that's really gaining momentum. And that's what we're going to have to fight. So when we think about this decrim that we've been talking about, I call it diet decrim or something like that over the last hour, you can be sure in 2 years, Pierre Poilievre, when he gets to be prime minister, he's going to tear that up because his political daddy, Stephen Harper, tore up the Section 56 for Insight. And all the people who fought for Insight and then got the half measure that Insight turned out to be found themselves then having to defend that half measure against what could be even worse. And we may have to do that again in 2 years, that we've all fought for something better than what we got in Decrim. And then who's going to be the one left defending it when the right comes for it? Well, it sure isn't going to be the people, the bureaucrats and ministers who wrote it up and watered it down. It's going to be us. It's going to be us, because we know that 1 gram either way actually affects a lot of people's lives. Yeah. So yeah, it's going to be us. And that's the job, and that's always been the job, that we have to defend from the right wing attacks on really crappily punitive run needle exchanges. Like all of these reforms, it's down to us to defend them. And I mean, I don't just mean VANDU. I mean the movement of people who use drugs and our allied movements that come together in something like the Defund 604 movement. I mean, the people in allies. I mean, sometimes in the labor movement, like we all walk together on a whole bunch of issues, but that's who's defending it in the end.
Yeah, I mean, not to put too fine of a point on it, but like truly, I think drug users are an active target for fascist organizers, whether they're within the Conservative Party of Canada, whether they're in police unions, whether they're in the Alberta model of treatment and recovery, whether they're in the BCNDP. Like, that is what we're watching unfold, is a fascist backlash to some fucking solid organizing, decades of it. And I mean, I think that wave of resistance also, as always, highlights that's how afraid they are, right? That's how afraid they are of people who are meeting at like the boardroom at 380 East Hastings. That's how afraid they are of like the organizing that you're able to do around a core planning table. Like, that we work with scraps, literally scraps. As Jeremy said, folks are not making bank off of this, and still the response you see is like a coordinated federal PR campaign that involves like every overpaid lobbyist and politician. So, I mean, kudos to you folks, because I mean, you got Stamatakis and Kaisers like shaking in their boots. You've got Polyev coming down here every other month to cry about the conditions at Crab Park or at Hastings Tent City. As we're like wrapping up this panel, I do want to again like ask some questions. We haven't been able to get through everything in the chat or what folks sent in advance, but there's a couple questions here that I think would be really useful for people who are watching, who are like, you know, hearing about the onslaught, like, and the slaughter really of drug users, both in Vancouver and across so-called Canada. What do you folks want from people who consider themselves bystanders or allies? Like, where do you want to see them? What can people do? Because I think people feel, hopefully the 66 people here are like, this is fucked and we need to support you. So where would you tell folks to kind of step in? Kill your cop dads? Jeremy, let's hear it.
Yeah, I mean, this question is so hard, and it almost makes me want to cry, because I don't know what people can do. It feels so helpless all the time. Like, you know, there's the plain old stuff. It's like, you know, write your MP, write your MLA, like attend protest, donate where you can to causes you believe in. But it's like, at the end of the day, I'm like, we're doing what we think needs to be done, and it's so slow. Like, well, all of our friends are dying. Like, it's so bad. Like, I don't know what to say other than, you know, like, be vicious and proactive and assertive. That's you know, it's all I know.
I think there's three great examples right here, right? There's the law school people. I forget the organization, what it's called. Yeah. There's the Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and there's Pivot. And those are, I don't know who's a drug user and who's not a drug user, but I know that those people, as law students and lawyers, have like organized themselves and their skills to join this fight. And so that's what I say is, wherever you are, that's the place to start organizing. You know, like, maybe you think, oh man, but like, my church group, is that the right? Yes, that's the right place. That's the perfect place. You know, like your community center, you're in spaces, people are in spaces that we may not be, right? Like, there's a bunch of drug user groups around the 300 block of East Hastings, but there's like not a lot of organization in all kinds of parts of the rest of the world, but there's drug users everywhere. There's like chartered accountant drug users, and there's like dump truck driving drug users, and there's like airplane flying drug users and all of that shit. And so wherever there is society, wherever there is this shitty world, there's people trying to take the edge off it a little bit. And that's spaces we need to be in. So in my mind, you can start wherever you are, and you know best, because you know that terrain. Say it's your church group, right? Say that the people are just always angry about needle litter or something like that. Well, that's a great issue to start taking on, right? Like how you can address that, how you can clean it up, how you can stop people from radicalizing themselves onto the far right because they've seen a needle once in their life sitting on a street. You know, there's like a lot of places that we will never know of and never be. And if you're there, if you're in one of those places, or at least me, I mean, that's a good place. The trade union movement, right? This is a working class issue. If you're in a trade union, like a teachers union or a nurses union or whatever union, you know, Unifor, what is it? Those are all great places. And we've seen people starting to organize there in the last year, passing resolutions, trying to improve things for drug users at work so that people don't get shit canned if they ever like admit to using drugs. Wherever you are, that's a good place to start.
Do you want to answer? Do we have?
No, you go ahead.
I agree with Garth. You got to organize, right? And you guys got to figure out for yourselves how you move, you come into the movement. But power is power, right? Whether it's, you start organizing with a union, with a church group, with a tenants association, because we know that, the whole, one of the big lies around decrim is going to stop death. That's fucking bullshit. Throw that out. But we also have to remember is that like what affects a drug user life is not just one policy or this other policy. Or this other policy. The strength of VANDU is been able to see, beginning with the drug user's experience, of all the massive exploitative and dominating systems that people are subjected to, whether it's housing, whether it's policing, whether it's healthcare, whether it's just plain old racism, right? Because, just last week, one of our comrades and a ex-board member of VANDU, Howard, was picked up off the street. He's been living in a tent for the last 4 years. And he was picked up by cops because he was trying to defend his tent against a city worker and he beaked off at the guy, and the city worker, charged him, right? We beat the case, but it flagged him in the immigration system. So now Howard is going to be deported in 2 days, right? It's fucked up.
It's really
right?
fucked up.
And
I
so,
would marry him if I could, just to keep him here, but yeah.
And so like think about that, like all of these other systems, right? It's not just drug policy, it's not just the cops, but it's this whole damn system, right? That is squeezing the blood out of our community, right? And expelling people, killing them. And so if however you enter this movement, you need to build strength through organization, and it doesn't need to begin with any drug policy expertise. You don't have to be a law student to organize. In fact, most of the time that's actually it makes it a little bit harder to organize, let's say. But I think it's really important that we build power wherever we can, and that we unite these different fractions of the working class, because it's a fight against, this is a class war, right? As much as a drug war, war on drug users, it's a war on poor people, right? And the system will use whatever means to expel you or kill you, and we have to fight back. And especially thinking about these so-called like experts at BCCSU, the BC, like all these kind of scientists and whatever, like they need to wake up, because as Garth said, the Pierre Poilievre is coming for harm reduction, and thus their jobs, right? And they benefited a lot. They made a lot of fucking money off of the lives of people from VANDU or drug users all over the province. And so they need to wake the fuck up and know that, their job is, Pierre Poilievre is coming for the fucking jobs, right? And so, they need to wake up, and everyone needs to fucking wake up, because this bigger movement against harm reduction is something that is just waiting in the wings, and we have to prepare, we have to fortify. And that starts with building strength through organizing.
I'm gonna pass it to Jeremy, who I think had something to say, and then I think we're gonna just wrap up. Maybe.
Yeah. I think I was being a bit of a crybaby or whatever, but consistency and persistence are key. That's what I would say. Persistency and consistency are key. When you don't feel like showing up to one of the causes, go anyways. When you don't feel like calling into one of these city hall movements, do it anyways. It's exhausting and you'll grind yourself down to the bone, but it's numbers and people always being there that counts. So
it feels better than being alone in this. I gotta tell you, fighting feels better than just losing by yourself. Fighting and living feels better than dying by yourself. Even if you don't win, even if you don't get the whole fucking mandate, the whole manifesto. It sure feels better to mourn together than to be sad by yourself.
Exactly. Well, all right, then you talked me into it. And it's really sad, so many people are dying by themselves, when they've done the fight, and it's a real shame, and to be alone and all that, right? It's better to be around people that are the same pretty much, or come from the same, how do you say that, they get cut from the same piece, the same piece of cloth, right? And just to reach out and find out what you can do and step up and do something, right? Because sooner than later, it's all going to end, and it's going to be a real shame, because this new guy that's trying to come in, he doesn't want harm reduction, he doesn't want this, he does, and it's like, it's their way of trying to kill off the little people, so to speak, right? And it's but you know what, when and if there's ever a big natural disaster, all those blue collars are going to look for the little people to help them survive. Hello. Right? And I mean, just in my head, in my world, I don't know, right?
I think
so many comrades I've lost and I miss them terribly. And, you know, and I know they're looking at us and they're cheering us on and they're giving us a shove when we feel like we don't want to do it anymore, right? There's a lot of days where I feel like I don't want to do it anymore, but I keep going, right? And I'm real grateful to them and to be able to have this chance to keep trying to fight the good fight. You know, the fight on the war, the fight on the poor, right? At some point in a couple of turns of a head, anybody could be poor and be in the same situation. Then what? Right?
Mhm.
My 2 cents.
Love you, Del.
Love you too.
And I think for people
Love
who
you.
wanting to get involved, it's also like, you know, don't expect to show up to like a fully formed crystallized space. Like we're building this together.
Mhm.
And I think like it's not a volunteer gig, it's not joining a political party, it is really co-organizing and struggling together. So it also means like you're not going to get a cookie for showing up, but you're going to, you know, you just have to keep showing up, right? That's what it is. It's relational. That's, I think, the biggest piece of the drug user led struggle in BC. It is so relational. It's not about whether or not you've got a tenure track gig, if you've got shirk funding, if you've got an academic researcher on your side, if you've got a cush job within a ministry. It's like relationships are what drive this work. And people also watch how you move through this work. Are you coming in because you want to put something on your resume, or are you coming in because you're like seeing yourself as part of the struggle? You're not just a bystander, you're actually part of this fabric of building a better world. Delilah, I want to just pass it over to you. We've come to the end of tonight's panel, Decrim 2.5. And again, I want to acknowledge the folks from Law Students for Decrim and Students for Sensible Drug Policy for all of the labor that they've put into this, for bringing this conversation together, for inviting everyone. I think that they'll probably make the conversation available after the fact. But right now we're going to close with silence, led by Delilah. So over to you.
Oh, wow, what a great discussion. I've had a headache a majority of the day, and I think it's because I just figured it out. I didn't have a coffee today. Good golly, what's wrong with me anyways, right? Yeah, we here at VANDU with a lot of the meetings and stuff that we usually have hold a moment of silence for those that have gone before us, the missing and murdered women and girls and men and boys of almost anywhere, the real struggles in life, the highway of tears, you know, bad relationships, people in institutions and all that, and you know, people being murdered by the higher ups, you know. Yeah, if you want to say any kind of names of anybody you can think of, and then we can hold the moment of silence. Let this moment be for them. All my relations.
Thanks, Del.
Yeah, no worries, man. I love you guys.
Love
Thanks,
you
Del.
too.
I like everybody because normally I
Stay
love everybody.
safe.
I don't like everybody, so
Keep 6, everybody. See you.
you too, Mr. G.
You too, Pantene Queen.
Thank you, Mannoe, for
Thanks,
moderating.
Meenakshi.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Meenakshi.
thank
Thanks,
you.
Taya. Thanks, Megan.
Thanks to
Bye,
everybody.
everyone.
Yeah.
Again, yeah.
Yeah, see you guys soon. Love you guys. Be
Love you
safe out
guys.
there.
Be safe, everyone.